So diversity itself could be positive or negative depending on the particular expression. Another important aspect to recognize when it comes to culture is that cultures change. Cultures do not remain static. And often we could say, you know, if cultures don't change, they usually die off. Now, that doesn't mean that cultures entirely change. There may be some things that remain constant throughout a particular culture, certain ideas or values, but the expressions of that might change. You know, one of the things that we'll talk about in later sessions is the interaction between Christianity and Western culture. And as we sit here in the 21st century and think about how Christianity is expressed, let's say in the United States, if we were to time travel back to the first century, or were able to bring somebody from the first century to the present, there would be quite a bit of difference in how we engage in worship and how a first century Christian engaged in worship. And so Christianity as a religion, as a cultural system, has changed. But on the other hand, again, in our time travel example, there are probably some things that we would say, oh, well, I can, even though I'm from the 21st century and I'm here in the first century, you know, I still recognize what's being done now, right, at this element, this time in worship, right? I recognize communion. I recognize that we're singing to God. I recognize that God's word is being read. Right? And the same kind of thing would be, you know, even if we were able to cross the language barriers, of course. The first century Christian in our contemporary culture would also recognize some of those things. Oh, okay, you know, it's communion. You know, we're singing to God. The word is being read. But there are a lot of other aspects that we would say, you know, is quite different as a cultural system. Cultures change in a variety of ways. Some is just development. Right? While I have a difficulty accepting evolution as an entire explanation for the origins of human life, right? I don't think it's sufficient to talk about why we are here and who we are. I do recognize that cultures evolve over time. They develop. Some of those developments, you know, are intentional. Right? People intentionally trying to bring about change. Some of those are unintentional, the byproduct of some things. But cultures generally go through progressions of development and evolution of you know, change. Cultures also change due to contact. Right? If we think about, let's say, Native Americans in North America prior to Columbus. Right. Their culture had changed over the centuries that they were here prior to that. But because of the contact between Native American cultures and European cultures, it went through a great momentous cultural change. Right? And so had Native American cultures and European cultures never interacted, Native American culture would still change, European culture would still change, but because the two interacted, both cultures ended up changed. So as people contact and engage in, you know, as they connect with other people, all right, globalization today, and we'll talk about globalization in another session, right, as our world becomes smaller and we connect with people from different cultures, as we contact those people, as those people, you know, as we understand them greater, as we, you know, think about who we are in relationship to them, right? There's greater and greater contact and our culture is going to change, and their culture is going to change. And so contact with other cultures brings about change. Modernization brings about cultural change. You know, that evolutionary component certainly talks about change, but as cultures modernize, there is a great significant change that takes place. You know, if you think about a lot of the technologies that we have today, you know, you're taking an online course, you're watching a video that I have constructed in my office. You know, that in itself, 40 years ago, was not something that people necessarily thought of, something that people didn't necessarily conceive, right? 40 years ago, they're just beginning to move into more personal types of computing where computers are a thing that people would have in their offices in general or in their homes. And certainly not the technologies we have that are portable even. And so were we to do kind of a historical survey of how our culture has changed in the last 40 years, we would see great, significant, meaningful changes that have happened because of modernization. And the same kind of thing happens with other cultures as well as they modernize it, particularly with technology, globalization, economic changes. All of those things tap into how cultures change. Right? They are the vehicle for cultural change, and they are also the impetus for cultural change. So cultures aren't static. They change and develop. So if that's true, right, we have cultural diversity, we exist in cultures, cultures change, how do we think about then the relationship of our first two terms, Christian and culture? Now already we've made the argument, the claim, that despite there being cultural differences, there are some things that are true regardless of culture. No matter what culture you live in, if you are to be Christian, you must believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That doesn't matter whether you're Chinese, whether you're African, whether you're North American, whether you're South American. Right? This is true. So there are some things within Christianity, we would say, that transcend culture. On the other hand, the mission of Christians is to go into all the world, meaning that while we hold these universals, we are to, as a church, engage other cultures, contact other cultures. And we're fortunate that other Christians did the same thing, right? I mean, Christianity started off as a Middle Eastern religion, right? Within Judaism, on the frontier almost of the Roman Empire. Had not those Jews crossed cultural boundaries, right? Those Jewish followers of Jesus, had they not done that, right, crossed those cultural boundaries, accepted that they were going to have to learn new cultures, then we wouldn't have that message. So now, what do? Well, you know, we have to kind of think about, okay, there are some things that are true regardless of culture, but there are other things where diversity can exist. Which means, of course, in the greater scheme of things, is culture something good or bad? Is it something to embrace or to reject? This is also a very important question for Christians. As Christians, we are separate from cultures that we live among, have a culture unto ourselves, but we are to be in the world as well, right? So we exist in cultures, some of which we have to say, is everything that is within this culture good, or should I embrace culture or should I reject culture? As people have thought about this and thought about the relationship between God and culture, they have presented a couple of different options. Just to highlight them, and then we'll talk more about them in more depth. So, some people conceptualize God as in contrast to culture, or God against culture, an antagonistic relationship. Others have been more of conceptualizing this in terms of God within culture. Others have reflected on this and come up with and thought about God being above culture. And then finally, others, of course, have thought about, well, God's above culture, but He's through culture as well. So how does God relate to culture? And then, of course, with that, how do Christians relate to culture? So for some, they conceptualize it as God against culture. Remember, we're thinking about this relationship. Is culture something to good or evil, something to embrace or reject? Well, for some people, God is opposed to culture. That God stands against cultural production, the things that are produced within a culture. The media, maybe not all the behaviors, but essentially, in its essence, for some people, they believe that Christians are to separate themselves totally from the world, insulate themselves. And so they see the Christian life as one of escaping from the world. One of the problems with this view, or one of the consequences of this view, is the assumption that all aspects of culture are evil, that there is nothing positive within culture. However, of course, we are to be in the world, even though we are not to be of the world. Right? So the withdrawal of Christians from culture becomes problematic, because how are we to share the message? How are we to exhibit our lifestyle if we pull ourselves away from the world? So while we might have a negative view of a lot of things in culture, to assume that God is completely opposed to culture and that Christians must totally reject it leads to additional problems.